In this video, we'll discuss ableism, broadly defined as discrimination against people with disabilities, as well as a few other things like the attitudes that people have toward people with disabilities, or PWDs as I'll commonly abbreviate it, the anxiety people feel when interacting with PWDs, and the employment discrimination that people with disabilities, or PWDs, face. Let's start by returning to the stereotype content model to see where the category disabled falls. Well, if you look in the top left-hand corner of the slide, you'll see that the category disabled is in the LCHW sort of cluster here, meaning that people tend to view disabled people as being low in competence but high in warmth, LCHW. And people with disabilities are typically met with paternalistic prejudice, and the emotions they often experience, the emotions people direct toward them at least, are pity and sympathy. But in addition to pity and sympathy, we see other emotions like discomfort and anxiety, which we'll also discuss. Our physical and mental ability can change, sometimes quickly and sometimes irreversibly. Some researchers have suggested that the awareness of this possibility explains people's discomfort with disability and the prejudice and discrimination that can result from this discomfort, often as a defense mechanism. Negative attitudes may also be linked to the belief that those who have lost some abilities are somehow flawed, even though it's unlikely to be their fault that they've lost those abilities. This can again lead to prejudice and discrimination, or more specifically to ableism. Ableism can be defined as prejudice against or a disregard for the needs of people with disabilities that, and I love this quote, is created by social, political, and environmental obstacles that turn impairments into disabilities. As Professor Dana S. Dunn wrote in 2015, disability can be viewed as, quote, less about the person per se and more about the world that he or she inhabits. To illustrate the role of environments in creating handicaps, Michael Oliver in 1990 revised a set of questions from a 1986 British survey of disabled adults. The left column of this table contains the original survey questions, and the right has the reworded questions. I want you to pay attention to the shift in focus from personal inadequacies in the original survey questions to conditions of the physical and social environment that serve as barriers for people with disabilities in those revised questions. Let's take a look at one example here. So the original survey question said, does your health problem or disability mean that you need to live with relatives or someone else who can help look after you? The revised question instead asks, are community services so poor that you need to rely on relatives or someone else to provide you with the right level of personal assistance? Here's one last example. Does your health problem or disability make it difficult for you to travel by bus? Again, placing the blame on the person with a disability. Versus in the revised question, do poorly designed buses make it difficult for someone with your health problem or disability to use them? In 1988, Joseph Schneider interviewed 80 people with epilepsy, which is a non-visible disability that can lead to seizures that can be relatively unpredictable. Interviewees described their interactions with others, and many noted how often they were told, directly or indirectly, that they were essentially incompetent and were in need of help. That sounds a lot like the stereotype content model, right? LC, low competence. A 35-year-old woman said this of her parents' behavior. They don't let you forget you have it. If they could only just forget about it, you know? I think they're well-intentioned, which is typically the case, but it's just that it's always in the back of their mind. Well, you have epilepsy, and I'll do this for you, and I'll do that for you. Here's another quote that reflects the idea that family members often focus on what the person with epilepsy was unable to do in these interview responses, rather than what the person could do, the person's capabilities. So one man described here, mostly my father told me I'd never be able to do things like everyone else could. One main thing that really stuck in my head was my father always told me, and my mother did too, I'd never be able to live a normal life, you know? I couldn't get a job where any tools were around or machinery, couldn't drive, couldn't go out mountain climbing hills, couldn't be in the boat, etc. Another concern that was voiced in these interviews was how others responded when they did have seizures. Schneider's interviewees were aware that both friends and coworkers worried about the possibility of a seizure, and so they felt like they needed to sort of keep an eye on them. As one woman stated, Like after I fall on the job, I've got people coming up and checking on me all night to see if I'm okay. You get to feel like a little baby after a while, and you don't get treated the same. Every once in a while, you'll see someone coming in like to go to the bathroom on my floor when there's one on their floor. In a way, it makes you feel kind of bad. You can't operate on your own 2 feet. Of course, while someone is experiencing a seizure, help may be needed, but typically seizures are short, and afterward the person with epilepsy is able to function competently. But Schneider's interviewees said it was difficult to refuse help, and so it made them feel incompetent. This is sort of benevolent prejudice, right? Just like what we saw with sexism and benevolent sexism. And these are the sorts of experiences that people with disabilities have all the time. Self-report studies show that college students' explicit attitudes, note a couple things here. First of all, we're talking about attitudes, not necessarily emotions. We'll get back to emotions soon. Secondly, we're talking about explicit attitudes. But nonetheless, college students' explicit attitudes toward PWDs are generally positive, which is good. One commonly used explicit attitude measure is the Disability Social Relationship Scale, which assesses people's willingness to work with, date, or marry a PWD. Eric Gordon and his colleagues found that people were most open to working with a PWD, but they were also open to a lesser degree to the possibility of dating or marrying a PWD. They also showed that these attitudes depended on the disability, though. For example, people are less accepting when the disability is cerebral palsy, for example, rather than epilepsy or blindness. But a wealth of research suggests that social desirability effects may be influencing these positive explicit self-report findings. PWDs report that non-disabled people often stare, laugh at them, or simply ignore them. College students with disabilities report having a chilly classroom climate, as evidenced by some faculty members' behavior toward them. In one study, for example, the authors report that some students in their study were told that their disability was, quote, their problem. They were encouraged to enroll in different sections of a course, or they were told that they could not succeed in the course without a tutor, which is heartbreaking to read. So those are some explicit results. What do we see in implicit measures of attitudes toward PWDs? Well, you've seen this slide before. This is the Brian Nosek et al. 2007 paper that reviewed the results of IETs with hundreds of thousands of participants on Harvard University's Project Implicit. Here we were focusing mostly on race, but I want to add one more row here, which is an IET about disability. Results from nearly 40,000 participants on Project Implicit reveal a preference for people without disabilities compared to people with disabilities in both implicit measures, like the IET, which is what you're seeing the results of here, as well as explicit measures. And moreover, this preference was among the strongest effects for all of the social domains they looked at in this entire paper, even compared to, for example, biases about gender and race. I mean, look at this effect size here, 1.05. That's the biggest one out of all of these. So this is a huge bias. And just to illustrate that in a little bit more detail, in the study, 76% of the sample, 76% of participants showed a pro-abled implicit preference, while only 9% showed a pro-disabled preference. So that's a big imbalance. And the relative negativity, toward disabled people was consistent across genders, ethnicities, age groups, political orientations, and more. More than 3,000 of these participants, moreover, reported having a disability themselves, and even they showed an implicit preference for abled people over people with disabilities, although it was a bit weaker than for people without disabilities, but they also found that same pattern of results for explicit measures as well. So this is a very consistent finding. But the experiences of PWDs depend on several factors. As I already mentioned, the type of disability makes a difference. For example, is the disability visible or concealable? If it's concealable, well, the person may be able to navigate their social environments unimpaired, unimpeded. Controllability also makes a big difference. This is another factor we need to pay attention to. As we've already learned, specifically in regards to weightism, aspects of people's identity that are viewed as uncontrollable, that is, not their fault, are treated much more positively than, quote, controllable aspects of their identity where we get blame assignment or victim blaming. A 2005 study showed that physical disabilities are seen as less controllable than is mental illness. And speaking of mental illness, we have lots of evidence to suggest that mental illness is treated differently than physical disabilities, at least in part due to this issue of perceived controllability. In 2007, for example, Mental Health America surveyed a representative sample of Americans about their mental health attitudes, and they showed that although attitudes toward mental illness are slowly becoming more accepting, we still have lots of room to improve. Let's take a look at the results. 72% of the people saw depression as a serious medical illness rather than as a sign of personal weakness, compared to only 38% in 1996. Now, this is a huge improvement in the perceptions of mental illness, yes, but this means that 28% of respondents did see depression as a sign of mental weakness. And moreover, participants in the study, respondents in the study, were much more likely to see mental illness as a sign of weakness compared to cancer or diabetes, and they reported that they would be uncomfortable having a coworker, elected official, teacher, or romantic partner or date who had depression. But comfort levels were much higher for a person with cancer or diabetes in nearly every category. So there is a sort of a bias against mental illness in this case. Experimental research also shows that PWDs' perceived suitability for employment depends on the nature of their disability as well. For example, a 2003 study asked advanced undergraduate business students to evaluate job applicants for a more complex job like a phone operator or a less complex job like a janitor. And the applicants had one of 4 disabilities depending on the condition. Either a developmental delay, developmental disorder, a chronic mental illness, which they chose bipolar disorder for, a back injury, or a head injury. And in all cases, the information the raters received showed that the applicants were always qualified for the job. Even so, however, the applicant with the back injury was rated as having better interpersonal skills and was predicted to have better job performance than applicants in the other 3 categories. However, the developmentally disabled applicant received the least negative ratings on the general evaluation measure. And hiring decisions were influenced by job complexity as well. The applicant with the back injury was preferred for the high complexity job. For the low complexity job, raters were equally likely to recommend applicants with a back injury, a developmental disability, or a head injury, but were less likely to recommend the applicant with bipolar disorder, with that chronic mental illness. Harlan Hahn in 1988 proposed that people without disabilities experience 2 types of anxieties when interacting with PWDs, which may account for some of these effects. Aesthetic anxiety represents the, quote, fears engendered by persons whose appearance deviates from the usual human form or includes physical traits regarded as unappealing. Often these associations lead people to ignore PWDs, whom they see as physically unattractive. Existential anxiety, in contrast, is associated with the belief that people with disabilities are helpless or dependent, and is related to the fear of losing one's own physical abilities, which can prompt people to think about their own mortality, sort of a very different kind of anxiety here. Dana Dunn, who we've heard from already, I quoted her earlier, notes a 3rd type of anxiety as well related to PWDs. Anxiety due to uncertainty about unstructured social encounters. People with disabilities are a relatively small percentage of the population, so most people without disabilities have had limited interactions with them and may, as a result, feel awkward, circling back to discomfort here, when engaging with them in social interactions, and this can lead to anxiety or avoidance, again, ignoring PWDs, which we've seen already. Aesthetic and existential anxiety are reflected in the characteristics associated with PWDs. For example, in 2010, Michelle Nario-Redman asked participants to list the characteristics of men or women with disabilities. Respondents both with and without disabilities agreed that women and men with disabilities are stereotypically, again, not necessarily accurately, but stereotypically viewed as dependent, incompetent, asexual, weak, passive, heroic survivors, again, there's that benevolent prejudice, and were seen as unattractive. Men with disabilities were also seen as angry, inferior, and lazy, whereas women with disabilities were uniquely also seen as societally excluded, vulnerable, and poor or homeless, which I think is kind of odd. As is hopefully clear from many of the results I've reported in this video, stereotypes about disability, as well as ableism globally, are largely the result of either ignorance, a lack of information, or simply a lack of experience.